Well, hello there and welcome to the Centre for Independent Studies. It's great to see you here this evening. My name is Tom Switzer. I'm the Executive Director here at CIS. CIS, for those of you who don't know, is a public policy research organisation that's been around for nearly 50 years, and we focus on various public policy issues, economics, education, culture, China and the world, and Indigenous affairs. But we're especially proud of our education program, led by my colleague, Glenn Fahey. Now, this evening, it's a great pleasure to launch my colleague, Salvatore Babones' new book. It's called Australian Universities, Can They Reform? Now, Salvatore has been an adjunct scholar here at CIS for the last 3 years, and for more than a decade, he's been a professor of sociology at the University of Sydney. In recent years, Salvatore has emerged as one of our nation's leading scholars. We are particularly proud of the various publications by Salvatore for us here at CIS, most notably a paper in August of 2019 called The China Student Boom and the Risks It Poses to Australian Universities. And among other things, that report highlighted the scale of the university's China risk. Now, in that groundbreaking report, which attracted a massive amount of publicity, both here at home and abroad, Salvatore warned about the very large financial risks of over-reliance on China. Now, to launch Salvatore's latest book, we're very pleased to welcome Simon Haines back to CIS. Simon is the Executive Director or the CEO of the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilisation. They're our friends. And then we'll have a discussion led by my colleague, Glenn Fahey, and he'll open it up to a discussion with the three of them, and we'll open it up to questions with you, the audience. But first, let's please hear from Simon Haines, and please welcome him. Thank you.
Can they reform? I think Salvatore's conclusion is maybe. But I'm going to give you a bit of historical context, if you'll forgive me, just to begin with. Universities have existed in the West for almost 1,000 years. Bologna was founded in 1088, when the year that William the Conqueror died. These are, as a group, the oldest institutions that we have. And in some fundamental ways, they actually haven't changed an awful lot. So whether they can be reformed is moot. The academics and their guilds, ancestors of the NTEU, have always been rightly protective or spiky, defensive, perhaps I should say, about their autonomy. That's one thing. On the funding side, there's always been a mix of the private and the public. Fee income, on the one hand, in private universities like Bologna, and tax or tithe income, on the other hand, in places like Oxford and Paris, which are public universities. And then in terms of the curriculum, well, right from the beginning, universities have always taught essentially two kinds of knowledge. One kind is pure knowledge, which the Greeks called episteme, hence epistemic, epistemology and so on. That meant theology and logic to begin with. And that was just for the beginning. That was just for, let's say, 800 years. Just not much more than that. But more recently, of course, pure science has taken up much of that pure knowledge space. The other kind of knowledge was practical. In a private institution such as Bologna, practical knowledge meant medicine and law, professional skills training, in other words. And the Greek term for that is techne, hence technical. And it's now more important than ever in the sense that universities have occupied so much more of the professional and technical training spaces than they used to. But, and this is the point I want to make, and then I'll leave it hanging and come back to it right at the end. There was another ancient kind of practical knowledge, taught just like the pure kind at all the universities, whether they were private or public. And this second kind of practical knowledge was called phronesis in Greek. And very roughly, what that means is wisdom, virtue training, you could say, or at least awareness of virtue, how to live the excellent life, or how not to, or at the very least to learn what such a life would look like, always drawing on examples from the past. So I'll come back to it. Now, of course, the techne kind of practical knowledge, the professional training, has always had an unshakable status. Families will always want their children to have good careers. Law and medicine and other professional training degrees have always been at the heart of the Australian university, for example, as the originally colonial institutions evolved after 1850 to deliver much the same kind of training program via more or less identical and very large local universities in each of our 6 state capitals. But meanwhile, pure or epistemic knowledge is regarded with equal status and prestige because it's kind of noble, right? Intrinsically high prestige. And I'm mashing together some quotes from the poets here. Mankind was not formed to live like beasts, but to pursue knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bound of human thought, to boldly go where nobody has gone before. That was Captain Kirk. The other two were Tennyson and Dante. But from the 19th century onwards, as it began to dawn even on the universities that maybe Galileo and Newton were onto something, and therefore empirical knowledge, which the Greeks called physis, achieved equal prestige alongside the pure form, so that the two of them basically merged in the modern sciences. Well, from then on, in the 19th century, that pursuit of knowledge took the form of research, and it became institutionalized in the German universities from the very beginning of the 19th century in the model created by Wilhelm von Humboldt. And the high aspiration of the research university was to taxonomize all knowledge, every kind of knowledge, in thousands of different compartments. And this was also a scientific enterprise. The humanities were now called the Geisteswissenschaften, which means the science of spirit. So everything is scientized. I'm a humanities professor, of course. And this model was exported to the USA by the end of the century as academics became just as professionalized via the grad school mechanism in the US as all the other professional careers already were. As for us in Australia, in our own, actually London and Scottish discipline-oriented system, that's where we've derived our university structure from. So here, with the strong metropolitan base and a professional orientation, that obsession with research didn't really take off for 100 years after the beginning of the Australian University until the creation of the ANU, just after the Second World War. And of course, since then, the research rankings, fixation, and grant-seeking imperatives have increasingly overwhelmed the whole sector. So I guess my point is that the ways in which we think about universities are rooted in some fundamental practices and attitudes. So these are just enduring aspects of what universities are, what they've always been. But at the same time, as we know, the remit of these institutions has been hugely extended over the last 50 years, or even 30. And the question is whether we may also, in addition to extending this remit, have strayed in damaging but maybe correctable ways from these basic forms of institutional knowledge activity from education. And I think this extremely high quality and very much needed book by Professor Salvatore Babones is saying that yes, we have strayed, but also yes, this is correctable. And I hope he won't correct me. It should be read by everybody involved with university governance and strategy at all levels, by vice-chancellors and their teams, by state and federal ministers of education, by tertiary education gurus of all kinds, by the somewhat impervious Canberra and state education, I was going to say blobocracies, that's a new word maybe, and of course our esteemed higher education media, some of whom are probably here this evening, and if not, they should be. So before I talk about what's so terrific about this book, forgive me for a slightly tongue-in-cheek kind of parenthesis at the beginning, and a bit ironic really. There's only 1% of the book that you might want to read with a little bit of skepticism, which is the bit about the Ramsay Centre. Because for entirely understandable reasons, Salvatore has had to follow the narrative around our early negotiations at the centre with a couple of universities 4 years ago, because that narrative was crafted and was put out in the public domain by their senior managers and by their PR departments, while for our part, the Centre had to be much more circumspect in our comments, given that we were already engaged in equivalent negotiations with other universities whose senior management had no such issues with us or with the project, and with whom we are now, I should say, very happily partnered. So we had to be a bit more cautious, but Salvatore had to go with what he could find in the public domain. So my real business is actually with the other 99% of this excellent book, with which I find myself in furious agreement. And I want to take just a second to list the key takeaways from the book, inconvenient propositions that are in urgent need of our consideration and engagement. And I'm going to mention, if you'll bear with me, 8 of them very quickly. 1, domestic undergraduate students, Australian undergraduates, are heavily discriminated against by our tertiary system. They are cash cows. They are low priority. They are in huge classes within giant impersonal institutions. I think this is something very important that Professor Babones is saying, and I'm going to come back to that in more detail at the end. Second, international students have also been exploited on a very large scale indeed. And purely to give some idea of the scale, not the exploitation, the numbers involved. Professor Babones informs us that 7 of the 8 largest Chinese universities outside China, 7 out of 8 are in Australia. Remarkable figure. He also says that there are 20 international students for every 1,000 Australians. That doesn't mean for every 1,000 Australian students. That means for every 1,000 Australian people, there are 20 international students. Remarkable. Now, the huge revenue generated by this vast student group is not used to offset infrastructure costs and thus reduce some of the burden on domestic students. Instead, it's creamed off on a marginal revenue basis to support strategic research initiatives controlled by senior university management. University leaders tend to see themselves, Salvatore says, rightly I think, as running huge for-profit businesses rather than the public interest education enterprises that they should be running. So that leads me into one of his more memorable observations, the third point, and this is a wonderful quote: "The whole system of research support is one giant mess." So elegantly put, and maybe he'll expand on this when we have the Q&A a little later on. There's no time to spell out now in detail how this is shown in the book, but it is, and it's well worth reading. And closely connected to it is the fourth proposition that Salvatore makes, which is that the reward and incentive structure for academics at the coalface is heavily skewed and incentivised towards grant seeking and research prestige, and away from classroom teaching. Fifth point, and this is important given the funding crisis that universities are always saying they're in, and never more loudly than in the last 2 years, of course, Salvatore says that they are not underfunded. And if there is a funding challenge, it's more likely to have been because of bad investment decisions by universities rather than the drying up of either government revenue or overseas student fees. Next point, to point the finger in the other direction, not your direction, this does not mean that governments should duck responsibility for the sector. On the contrary, ministers at state and federal levels represent us, the taxpayers, who supply most of the revenue for these huge enterprises. And these politicians are our representatives and they speak for us all, even though university managers and academics alike all tend to represent them as outrageous intruders on sacred campus spaces and dire threats to academic freedom. If anything, politicians themselves are nowhere near persistent enough, says Professor Babones, not persistent enough in uncovering what's going on inside these opaque but largely taxpayer-funded institutions. So the politicians are not improperly interfering, they're instead holding accountable. They're properly insisting on transparency. And just as a bracket, there's a whole chapter in the book on this as being the main problem with the much debated China issue, the Chinese students issue, the involvement with China. That is the lack of public accountability. So finally, the last point that I want to draw your attention to in the book, and the longest one really, the one that most resonates with me, given what the Ramsay Centre's remit is and what my own academic kind of past is. And here I'm returning to the first point and what I was saying about wisdom. So what the book most leaves with me is Salvatore's observation, which is based on the quality indicators for learning and teaching, the so-called QUILT surveys. He says there's been one really significant failure in the area of teaching and learning, which is what is going to take me back to my first point. He writes, when pundits and universities and government talk about research, their focus is on excellence. When they talk teaching, they focus on numbers. Now, as he points out, it's not the learning quality and the content which are the major causes of concern in the area of teaching. As we all recognise, most academics do know their own research very well, and on the whole, in my experience, they tend to convey it pretty clearly. So it's not quality, not content. They offer good quality instruction, but instruction is not the same as education. The real problem, as Salvatore identifies it, is what's called student engagement. That is, we're not making the classroom experience what it should be to help students meet and learn from each other and from their teachers. As he puts it, we have arid learning environments rather than classes and campuses, which are, as he says, exciting places to be. So the whole person learning experience is deeply flawed and disappointing for getting on half the population cohort. Remember that whereas a generation ago, 5% of the demographic, the 18 to 21s, went to university, it's now closer to 50. Although, of course, the word university includes institutions which didn't count as universities in those days. Nevertheless, a very large percentage of our young people now go to university. So what happens is really consequential, what happens there. As Salvatore says, this is not just a COVID issue. It long predates the pandemic. Just as young people are reaching adulthood, and like everyone at that age, needing an identity and going through a values formation process, what I call invaluation, they're merely being instructed as isolated student units as per the ancient category of techne, but applied to the whole university. And by the way, I'm not talking here about the student experience in clubs, sports clubs, activist groups, newspapers, and so on. I'm talking about the education experience itself, which, should be the beating heart of the university. All this is in no small part because increasing numbers of potentially very fine teachers are first and foremost, in fact, researchers obliged to convey their research to young people, rather than at least some of them being incentivised to put teaching at the top of their career development. This is not a small point. With so many people now attending university, the weight of responsibility on university teachers and managers and on our governments to get all of this right for Australia is huge. And on Salvatore's account, this responsibility is being inadequately discharged with too many vested interests crowding out national interest. So here again, I'm returning to that third kind of knowledge, the other practical, non-technical kind that I left behind before, the knowledge of wisdom and virtue, of excellent lives, not just excellent research. This was a crucial part of the knowledge equation for many centuries. It even took precedence over the pure knowledge part for a while. But the arrival of the research university and the science paradigm slowly began to crowd it out, especially from the later 19th century, despite a dogged rearguard action in the American liberal arts colleges and to some extent in the more Oxbridge-y kind of quarters, ghettos, corridors of the Anglo-Australian tradition, where research tended to be looked on as a bit less kind of the right thing to do than scholarship. The very, very distinguished political philosopher Michael Oakeshott wrote 70 years ago, it's a wonderful quote, "A university will have ceased to exist when its learning has degenerated into what is now called research, or when its teaching has become mere instruction and occupies the whole of an undergraduate's time." Now, I think on that basis, what Professor Babones is absolutely correct in pointing us to, a situation where we might be watching the emergence of institutions which can't really be called universities in that old sense anymore. But instead, they are, on the one hand, huge professional training programs. Well, we've had those for 1,000 years, as I was saying, but now they're training very large parts of the population. They've extended their remit very widely. And where the old pure knowledge and wisdom functions used to be, we have instead equally enormous research institutes with instruction appendages kind of hanging off them. Now, I don't want to sound like one of those head in the clouds type humanities scholars with no appreciation of the scale and the national importance of what goes on in big STEM research programs. Of course, in many areas of medical, industrial or technical research, universities now make a massive contribution to the national interest and the economy, often, by the way, privately funded. The phrase knowledge industry brings together the epistemic and the practical functions that I was talking about quite neatly. But I think Professor Babones, who is not a head in the clouds humanities scholar, he's talking here about the student experience. That's his focus. And the risk is, as he's rightly saying, that we are losing an ancient thread of wisdom running through all those centuries, wisdom derived from a fully undergraduate-centred, teaching-led, immersive classroom experience. Learning about learning and learning about knowledge from other adjacent learning lives. Dare one say, I don't want to sound too Cardinal Newman-esque here, but this is even a mode of character formation that we're talking about. Now, the vast bulk of our undergraduates won't go on to become researchers and academics, and nor should they. Academics far too often, in my experience, act as if their main business was just to train more academics. That's not right. But that's all the more reason why undergraduates should be able to remember their university educational experience as truly formative, not just instructive. After all, remember, we're educating a whole society in these places now. Still, as Salvatore says, we can reform, I think he says, we can reform these institutions given the political will and some equally willing university leaders. The teachers are certainly there, if only they were properly incentivised to flourish. Our partner universities at Ramsay have some utterly brilliant academics teaching their Ramsay-funded Great Books degrees, and they're far from alone elsewhere in their own institutions and in the sector as a whole. In fact, and forgive me a little bit of a puff at the end, I can tell you this is only slightly exaggerated, the student engagement metric at the Ramsay partner degrees is through the roof compared to the average. It's pretty much the only one we're really interested in, I'd have to say, confidentially. Content, to look at those other teaching metrics, content is guaranteed in our degrees because the books on the curriculum are just the best books ever written, so the content's fine. And the small group format that we are funding means that teaching quality directly feeds into and is reflected in student engagement. So we follow the engagement. Student satisfaction ratings are very, very good indeed, let me just say that, in all three of our partner courses. And by the way, one of our partners, I won't say which one except it's a group of 8 university, they just told us that their version of the Ramsay degree is now the single most competitive course for entry in the entire humanities sector in Australia. So we're getting somewhere, I hope. Anyway, it seems to me that the Ramsay Centre and Salvatore Babones are very much on the same page. Congratulations to you, Salvatore, for producing this terrific, timely, profoundly important book, essential reading for all of us engaged with university education. And to everybody here, strongly recommend that you read it and you buy it. Really.
And now for the man himself, Salvatore Babones.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you, Simon, for that extraordinarily generous launch to the book. I really do appreciate it. I also appreciate the promotion. As Professor Haines knows quite well, I'm actually Associate Professor Babones, and that chair is looks a long way away when I think about the book I've just published. But thank you very much. Professor Haines is, of course, a humanities scholar, so I'll leave the Greek, the Latin, the German to him. Blobocracy's French, I think. As a monolingual sociologist, I'll stick to data. And I just want to take a few minutes to foreshadow for you some of the data that are in the book. I'm very proud of the fact the book has 23 very detailed charts and tables, providing a wealth of information about the Australian university system. When I wrote the book, I thought of it as I was writing for the minister. This was the book that the education minister should read to know about his own university system. And I'll start right there with who's paying. This is real revenue attributable per student. FSIL is just a term of art, equivalent full-time student load. You can think of it as per student for domestic and international students. It's how much is being paid on their behalf. Not just how much are they paying. Of course, domestic tuition is much lower than international tuition because the government's subsidizing it. What if we put together those subsidies and ask how much is going to support domestic students? For 20 years, international students enjoyed a massive discount, at some times as much as 1/3 on their Australian university degrees. That it's only recently converged across the whole system. It hasn't converged at every university. It's converged across the whole system because since 2014, we've seen a surge in international enrollments at the most expensive degrees at the most expensive universities. So at any given university, there may still be a gap, but we do see them converging at the national level. That's because since 2014, we've seen a huge surge in Chinese student enrollments. That's the heavy black line here. Chinese student enrollments at 2014 were already world leading, but since 2014, they've become simply extraordinary. They've become enormous. And they're concentrated at Group of 8 universities where they pay higher tuition than students at non-Group of 8 universities. And that's why we've seen nationwide a convergence in how much international students are paying versus domestic students, even though at particular universities, there's still a gap. There's a compositional issue there. Okay. Why this sudden surge in international students since 2014? Is it our extraordinary education? Is it the value proposition of an Australian degree, what you can do with it? It's how cheap the Australian dollar is. We've seen a massive decline since 2014. The Australian dollar reached parity with the US dollar during the global financial crisis. It's since dropped dramatically. This chart shows international student growth versus the value of the Australian dollar. You can see it's an almost perfect negative correlation. It's something like, it's greater than negative 0.9. That's as strong a correlation as you find anywhere in the social sciences. Students are coming here because our degrees are underpriced. And when the dollar drops down to its historic level, 0.7 to the dollar, our degrees are very underpriced. When our degrees are fully priced up at parity to the dollar, well, international students don't want to come to Australia. Okay. That money, as Simon indicated, has been fueling a rise up the rankings for Australian universities. That money is being skimmed off. That is, if you think of a class of 100 students at a typical Australian university, well, stuff in 50 more, make it 150 students, and use that extra revenue. Yeah, pay a little bit to pay the extra tutor you need, and use the rest of it to fund big-ticket research. That's fundamentally the financial model of international education at Australian universities. The Commonwealth pays for the classrooms, the Commonwealth pays for the research, the Commonwealth pays for the libraries, the Commonwealth pays for the campuses, and the international student revenue is free cash flow on top of that. And so we've seen this rise, especially since 2014 in the rankings. There's this drop in the Times Higher Education ranking that occurred due to a change in methodology around 2010, 2011. But since then, the rankings have increased on both the major rankings. And how have they done that? The universities have been recycling international student revenue into hiring what are called highly cited researchers. Highly cited researchers is not a judgment, it's a list. There's literally a list of highly cited researchers, HCRs, published by the consultancy Clarivate. And although there are gaps in the data, there are changes in methodology, you can clearly see that since 2014, there's been a massive run-up in Australia's concentration of highly cited researchers. That's not because we've suddenly become much better at research. It's because Australian universities have gone out and bought people who are on the list. And as a result of Australian vice chancellors chasing rankings, we've seen the percentage of the world's highly cited researchers, well, being hoovered up by Australian universities so that it's now almost 5% in the world, up from 2% in the world just a decade ago. All right. All of this is just a teaser for the book. Anyone who wants to see those data in detail, buy the book. I'm happy to sign a copy. I really want to thank the CIS for hosting this event, especially thanks to Simon for his very generous launch of the book. And obviously, thanks to all of you for being here. Much appreciated.
Okay, thank you very much, Salvatore. Now for our panel discussion with Salvatore, Simon Haines, and hosted by my colleague, Glenn Fahey.
Salvatore, you've given us a dire picture about the state of universities, but as you point out, the rankings keep going up. It can't just be about the highly cited researcher list. Surely the universities are improving and delivering a better product than they were 20 years ago.
The rankings are extraordinary. Australia has 38 or so, depending how you count, public universities. And in Australia, 8 of them are in the global top 100 on one of the major rankings. That means that Australia has more than 20% of its universities in the top 100. Compare that to the United States. There are only about 40 US universities in the top 100. At about 5% of its research universities, or about 10% of its research universities, or considering all of its universities, less than 1% of all of America's universities are in the global top. Now, the UK has a similar system to Australia, so it's maybe a better comparison. 5% of the UK's universities are in the global top 100 versus more than 20% of Australia's. Now, that's a good news story if you're an education minister. It's a bad news story if you're asking, is that true? It just seems almost impossible that this could be real. The numbers are just too good. And if you want the detailed argument as to why those numbers are too good, well, read the book.
But can I just add quickly, Glenn, and to ask Salvatore, international research rankings are very heavily science-loaded, science-skewed, right? Does that have any impact on what you're saying?
Not only are science skewed, humanities essentially don't count in most of the rankings. Not just humanities, business doesn't count, law doesn't count, social sciences barely count. Of the highly cited researchers in the social sciences in the Clarivate list, not a single one in Australia is anything other than a public health scholar. Yeah. So they're in the social sciences, but they're all public health scholars.
And Simon, you're a bit down on the sciences.
No, not at all.
Shouldn't we be welcoming that we've got a science focus, because this is going to deliver things like the ideas boom that we were promised?
Absolutely. And as I was saying, I'm not at all kind of anti-science. What I am as a humanities person is anti-scientistic. That is the introduction of scientific measurement methodology into areas of thinking where it's not appropriate. And to that extent, what worries me is that the way that the humanities is being squeezed out of the rankings is somewhat comparable to the way that teaching is being squeezed. You can see the same kind of long-term historical process happening in both cases. So I'm not anti-science.
The humanities are being erased.
Yeah.
Research output in Australia is measured using the OECD's Frascati manual. It's literally a book, a manual of how you count research. In order for your activity to be research, it has to be explicitly funded and explicitly measured. And you have to actually have a budget. You have to have dedicated funding lines and outputs for your research. They give an example. Critics said, well, then, is nothing the humanities does research? After all, I just have my time that I'm working to write something. And the answer was from the OECD, well, we can imagine that an historian could do work on paleoclimate, constructing temperature series. Well, if that's your paradigmatic example of historical research, there is no, and literally by official measures, there is virtually no research done in the humanities in Australia.
I remember not so long ago, Salvatore, a vice-chancellor, telling us at the university I was at that we needed to distinguish in future very carefully between research and scholarship.
Right.
And research was meant to be the production and discovery of new knowledge, and scholarship was just kind of going back and looking at old stuff. And it was a way of margin. It was explicitly, this particular VC was a very major scientist. This was a way of marginalising the humanities. It's only scholarship. I think the distinction's a false one myself.
But that distinction's written into the Texa. It's written into the Texa manuals.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the primary problem, is it a research one or is it a teaching one? Where's the quality problem? Is it both?
I would love to see our scientists teaching. Nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with having Nobel Prize winning. It's fantastic to have Nobel Prize winning scientists at your university. Get them in the classroom. In the US, they're in the classroom. Here in Australia, highly cited researcher scientists are very often recruited with the promise that they won't have to teach. And that's how we get them here.
And is this part of the grant process and the grant seeking is to relieve teaching duties in large part?
To escape teaching duties. It's how it's often. I mean, I've never forgotten an experience I had maybe 20 years ago, where running a committee which had people on the committee from both research-only positions and research and teaching positions. And the idea was to encourage some of the research-only people to do more teaching. And they visibly recoiled and said, the one great thing about this job is that I finally got away from teaching. I think that's where the problem is, to answer your question.
I think we too easily forget that the purpose of research in universities historically was to attract the best teachers. It wasn't simply that the university would produce knowledge in some abstract sense. In Australia, we've seen that redefined as instead of what an academic does is teaching and research, what a university does is teaching and research. And once you make that jump from the individual level to the institutional level, the obvious argument is, well, let half the people do research, let half the people do teaching. The problem is, then why should we fund that research in universities? Put it out to contract, right? If the Australian government really needs another study into Shelley's poetry,
oh, definitely they do.
and I'm certain they do, put it out to tender, right? Why should it be done at a university if it's not being done by a teacher?
Well, that would certainly play a great role for independent think tanks like this one, I'm sure.
No, you don't accept government funding.
Simon, you alluded to the greater role of universities that perhaps is being underfilled. This is the formative role for character building. What are the sorts of things that graduates should be leaving university with from the non-academic sense, Simon?
Well, I mean, you have to understand that from the point of view of the Ramsay Centre, but also my point of view as a humanities scholar, I might have a slightly different take on that from what a scientist or a person in the STEM disciplines would say. But what we argue is that the great books approach to humanities degrees that we advocate leaves graduates with the capacity to assimilate really complex pieces of thinking in verbal form, and then speak about it to a group of other people, as you might do in a committee or in so many places in future careers. That capacity to absorb complex texts and then articulate what it is that you've absorbed in a non-partisan, non-skewed, non-ideological kind of way is so important in careers in general, whether it's in the public or the private sector. And in a way, the more we rely in the economy on AI, on artificial intelligence, the more we need what we call HI, which is human intelligence. And this seems to us to be the most important way to absorb it and then to use it in your life. And it's, I mean, what I was saying earlier about academics who often make the mistake of thinking that what they're doing is training more academics. I think that's actually quite a reprehensible thing for them to think. Academics should think of themselves as training citizens and people for the wider community, not just more academics. And this is one of the ways you can do that.
So what ways is teaching quality undermined? Why is it that teaching quality isn't the standard we would hope for?
Simply put, what gets measured gets done. We don't measure teaching quality. Now, we do have student satisfaction surveys, and students generally are satisfied. We do have employer surveys, and employers say, yeah, we would hire people back from the same universities, not that they have much choice where they would hire people. But we don't actually have people observing classrooms. We don't have people, we don't have deans taking an interest. We don't have heads of school taking an interest. I've taught in Australia for 14 years. No one has ever visited my classroom. In the US, I was observed every year.
And not only that, but it's actually resented if somebody tries to observe. Yeah, right.
It would be.
Yeah.
And you're all welcome, by the way. Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Well, I mean, this comes to a greater point, though. So you paint University Salvatore as unaccountable, opaque, and conflicted in interests. Can you succinctly tell us in what ways is that the case? And we'll go then toward how do we do something about that?
Try to get vice chancellor performance metrics. If you want to know the performance bonuses of any listed company in Australia, what the CEO is being paid to do, you can get that. It's published. It's right in the annual report. In Australia, I've tried to get those via Freedom of Information requests, and I've been told, no, that's commercial in confidence and personal data. That's how unaccountable they are. The citizens, or in my case, the taxpayers, can't even find out what metrics they're trying to hit. They're less accountable than publicly listed companies.
And they're comparable size, right? In terms of the investment portfolio, the size of...
More importantly, they're public. They're not just publicly listed, they are public.
So is this a problem, though? Is this a problem?
So just to follow straight on from what Salvatore was saying, another area of opaqueness is if you want to find out exactly which courses are being taught by particular departments and particular faculties, as opposed to this huge list when you go to the online site of all the courses they've ever taught, actually finding out which ones they're currently teaching and exactly what the syllabus is really, really difficult to do. I don't see why it should be. Why can't we know that? In fact, I pity the young people who have to go to these sites and figure out which courses they want to do. It's very hard to tell. I don't know whether you find the same things.
Private, non-public information.
Yeah.
And isn't that part of the problem, is that there's no clear menu to guide student choice, to make good decisions about what they're learning. Salvatore, what should it look like?
Well, thanks for the in. I do have a CIS paper that was published Monday, suggesting a simplification of. There we go. It pulls up. It picks up on an argument from the book, suggesting a simplification of degree courses. That the Commonwealth should be pushing universities to have standardized degree courses, single degree courses, in things like arts, engineering, nursing, medicine, that then could be compared across university. Right now, the average university offers more than 90 different undergraduate degree courses. How can you compare the 90 courses being offered at one university with 120 at another university? They're simply not directly comparable. There's no way for the student or the prospective student to evaluate these different offerings. If we had some simplified degree offerings, everyone's offering the Bachelor of Arts, which one do you want? You could then look up the metrics. You could then look up the student satisfaction surveys. You could then look up the employer satisfaction surveys. You could even get average salaries. And we ask students, what is your average salary? But the data are only published at the level of the university because you can't split that out for 90 different courses at each of 38 different universities.
Well, the good news is there are some places overseas that do this, and that I think makes perfect sense.
It's routine in the US.
Yeah, routine.
Yeah.
Simon, what is it a problem that we've over-commercialised the university landscape?
I don't know enough about commerce to answer that question properly, really, Glenn. But from where I sit, let me put it differently. Let me answer a question you haven't exactly asked. What we have in this country is a university model that was derived from essentially an Anglo-Scottish university structure, not an American one. And the American model is of a liberal arts first degree or a liberal first degree, a very wide-ranging first degree, even too thin in many ways. But then the real professional training happens at the graduate school level. In the Anglo-Scottish and Australian system, it's not much of the training happens in the first degree, and not in a postgraduate degree. And so I think that makes a difference in terms of the way that commercialization of research can happen. In America, it's already it's built into the graduate school mechanism, whereas here we have no such mechanism. So whether it's over commercialized here or not, I just don't know. I would assume that much medical and technical and industrial research is done partly with private money, right?
Staying on the topic of money, Salvatore, universities are always telling us that they're underfunded. There's always a push from universities to emphasize the dire financial circumstances of universities, and that the slightest cut in funding would result in the drop in course offerings, the sacking of staff, bloodshed on campus in terms of staffing. Why are they wrong?
They're not wrong. Universities could spend more money if the taxpayer was willing to give it to them. There's no limit to the amount that can be spent. It's just like the defense forces. You can always spend more. You can always buy a fancier submarine, right? It's not a problem. What we can say is that Australian universities are better funded than their peers in the US, UK, and OECD. They're better funded than they ever have been. They are producing research at prodigious levels. It's hard to see any metric on which Australian universities are not better funded, except the one particular line in the OECD tables that the Group of Eight likes to cite, and this is a particular line of direct government funding, excluding indirect government funding, because of course Australia's Commonwealth support for students is indirect. It's not, the students' tuition is not paid directly by the government. They get a soft loan program to support their study. So they can cherry pick one statistic showing less funding for Australia than for the UK, which is a different funding model. But if you just look at the total government spending for universities, Australia is extremely generous.
And a final one from me, Salvatore, before we go into questions from the audience. International students are sometimes depicted as cash cows. Are international students in Australia cash cows, and is it a problem?
International students are cash cows being milked for research dollars. That is absolutely true. The problem is that first problem is they're being abused, and there are many abusive practices with the recruitment and retention of international students. But more broadly, the problem is that they're not going to support the larger mission of Australia's universities, which presumably should be to educate the Australian population.
The audience, it's your turn.
The practice of universities buying people who are on the list of highly cited researchers, is that really bordering on corruption, number one? Is it ethical? And is it an example of good character forming?
So first, it's very difficult to get the data on who they're hiring, when, and how. There's a lot of suggestive data. That's what's happening is they're recruiting scholars from Chinese universities who are retaining a position in China through what's called the 1,000 Talents program. So many of these highly cited researchers are Chinese scholars who are given the opportunity to live in Australia while continuing their research programs in China. And many of the highly cited researchers are very internationally mobile because they're given this opportunity by being on the list, quote unquote. Is that moral or proper or correct? Well, if I were a Chinese scholar being given the opportunity to come relocate to Australia with no teaching responsibilities, why wouldn't I? I don't see anything immoral in the person taking it. I see a problem in the university targeting this approach to gaming the rankings instead of trying to improve their overall productivity across the entire university as a strategy for improving rankings.
And to go to the character point, It might be very good for the character of the person who's coming here to do the research. But the point I was making was that in terms of the characters of the undergraduates are formed by the teaching, it doesn't make any difference at all because the person's only doing research.
Thank you, firstly, for wonderful presentation. I'm Professor Suzanne Rutland, Professor Emerita from Sydney Uni, from a very small department of Hebrew, Biblical and Jewish Studies. I want to come back also to this financial question, because in the last 3 years, our department's overheads, costs, it was UEM, now it's every time they change the acronym, have more than tripled. So we're told that we owe this little department something like $1.5 million for, despite the fact that every year we bring in substantial funding from specific foundation and donors, because we know we have small classes. And the only way one of our positions can even operate is by teaching within the big FAS course, and talking about what's happening with humanities is disaster. He has something like close to 900 FASs, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and every student has to do these generic courses. He has something like 900 students in his generic course that will give the students nothing and yet is compulsory. And it's the only way he can keep his head above water. So where is it coming from? Why is it that those overheads, and it's the last few years, have increased to a point where departments in the Faculty of Arts cannot function, and history, it's just horrific. Where is that? Why is that extra cost come?
Right.
And
let me leave the future of the humanities for Simon and just answer the narrower question about overhead. It's entirely right and proper that universities should increasingly employ non-teaching staff. A lot of people complain about the rising numbers of administrators. I think, well, no, actually, what I want from an efficiency standpoint is more and more administrators. The problem comes when those administrators don't do their job well. So, for example, I want to take the job of running the website for the class, take that out of my hands, have an administrator run websites. The problem of evaluating students who are ill for special consideration, let an administrator do that. Shouldn't be an academic responsibility. Taking care of disabled students, let's have an administrator do it. If we were doing that effectively and efficiently, that should be freeing up more resources for teaching in the classroom, because we would be taking highly paid, and we are highly paid academic staff, or whatever people may say. We're taking time off me and shedding my time, which is highly paid, and giving it to someone who is much more modestly paid to do administrative tasks. If the universities were doing that well, we would be experiencing a golden age because of all the resources freed up by this ever-increasing overhead. Now, the fact that you're not seeing more resources flow into teaching because of the higher overhead is indicative that it's not being done well.
But shouldn't also, just to continue with the question, shouldn't more resources be flowing into teaching from that huge research pot that's being creamed off from international students? Why does that all go into research and not back to teaching?
So when I said international students are themselves victims, a lot of that is because they're being offered a really low-class education. Their money, instead of being fed back into, well, I'll give you a very practical example. At University of Illinois, which is the most Chinese university in America with something like 5,000 Chinese students, they do airport meet and greet for students. They have special language classes for Chinese students. They have all sorts of programs targeted at helping Chinese students make the transition to university life in the US. In Australia, if you've passed the language exam, you're in. You're just a student, right? So you've passed your YELTS minimum, 7.0 or 6.5, depending on the program, you're in. Those resources are not being plowed back into making sure you have a successful career at university.
Just before we move on, is that something that's ultimately going to bring the demise around international students if we bringing them in and not actually delivering a high quality educational experience? Does it
Not
matter?
as long as the dollar stays down.
It's
it'll
a
be fine.
dollar, and as long as the sun keeps shining,
Yeah.
then that's the good times will keep rolling.
Look, I'm very close to a lot of Chinese student organizations. I talk to my Chinese students a lot. They tell me that Australia is the place you go when you can't get into an American university.
I wish I could give some sort of answer to the question the professor asked that's more satisfactory to me and to you. This is a desperately worrying and disturbing thing that you're drawing our attention to. I mean, the reason the Ramsay Centre is in business is precisely to make it possible to keep that model of intense small group teaching in the humanities alive. But we can only do that because of the generosity of one Australian billionaire who decided that he wanted to make it possible to do that. But without that level of private funding, I don't know the answer to your question. I don't know where this comes from. It just seems to me that over a long period of time, for reasons that Salvatore explains very well in the book, but the picture is even longer, you know, we've increasingly devalued teaching and the classroom teaching experience at the expense of this thing called research, which has huge value in many ways, but is squeezing out things that we would all want at least some Australian students to have access to. I don't know the solution. I can only agree with you that it's very worrying, and we're trying to kind of point that out simply by existing at the Ramsay Centre.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Salvatore, for your presentation. I've been a fan for years, and I'm very grateful for the CIS to having an on-site event, which seems to be increasingly rare in the city. Salvatore has highlighted that a big part of the university's business model is to basically squeeze research funding out of taxpayers to promote themselves up international league tables and with the international students, and at the same time local teaching of local students is sort of second order. My concern in all this is that it turns out that there's no credible, trustworthy quality control at the highest levels of university research, particularly in science. I claim to have documented 2 serious scientific frauds at the University of Sydney, and I've prompted 2 formal research integrity inquiries. I claim that twice the University of Sydney's most senior management have dishonestly pretended there's no problem. The priority seems to be to pretend that the science career is awesome, the university is awesome, and keep this whole show going. My question is, does anyone have any ideas about how that research integrity problem could be fixed? Because after a decade, I seem to have got nowhere. You can see AustralianParadox.com if anyone's interested in the background here.
Yeah, if you think it just might be possible that sugar consumption leads to obesity, talk to Rory. If not, talk to the University of Sydney academic board. Look, it's a problem. There is very little control for research integrity. We have the peer review process, but the peer review process has been much romanticized. It's not what it should be. But it's not just with medical research. Of course, we had in Quadrant. I do write a column for Quadrant magazine called The Philistine. If you haven't read Quadrant recently, I encourage you to pick up a copy. And there's been a lot there about the massacre map controversy at University of Newcastle and complaints about the plagiarism and inaccuracies and mendacity in the massacre map that were quietly corrected after much prodding, but with a lot of resistance from the university. So we saw, of course, the Peter Ridd fiasco about reef studies. So there's a lot of mendacity when it comes to big funded research projects, and I don't know what the answer there is. The answer is we'd like to see a better moral stance at universities, searching for the truth instead of searching for funding dollars. But I don't know how we get there.
Andrew Skinner. I taught for 6 years at Macquarie University as a sessional teacher, and with 40 years experience in business. But it was very clear to me that the whole emphasis on teaching quality was very, very low. And my cohort were mostly international students. I had about 200 at any point of time. That's give or take a bit, $600,000 to $700,000 of gross fee revenue. And the amount they'd spend on me for what I was doing was about 5% of that, right? Now, in all my other businesses, and I'm involved with lots of others, wages are normally 1/3 of gross income, roughly. So in other words, the universities are siphoning off massive amounts of money, particularly Macquarie University to build their hospital, because it's only, if you only teach medicine, then you're a real university. You're not a university if you don't teach medicine. So I came away from that 6 years experience absolutely despondent about the future of our education in this country. And the graduates that I saw coming out, their knowledge is less than a year 10 student that I seem to recall when I was at school. And I've been employing students recently, and their knowledge and experience and their application, they've spent so much time on their damn devices, they know nothing, and they haven't learned anything. They don't know how to converse, they don't know how to write, they don't know how to address people, right? So the universities are absolutely failing in their teaching output. And so consequently, every time they whinge and complain, I have, no...
Yeah.
And particularly in humanities, because unless you're producing medical research, you're not a person. Now, we live in a world where we have to absorb everything, right, so to speak. In other words, to be a balanced human, you need to be able to understand everything, the world around you. And if you're just purely focused on science, you're missing out on all these other things. So it's very interesting last night, Josh Frydenberg didn't mention universities once in the budget. No votes. But anyway, I'll leave you with that, because just a reflection on the money that's coming in from foreign students and the outcome that we're seeing.
Look, I want to stress it doesn't have to be that way. The U.S. news rankings in the U.S. focus heavily on the competitiveness of programs, on the teaching quality of programs, and on the increase in salaries that students get from going to different universities. And the interesting thing is, we have all that data for Australia. The Department of Education, Skills and Training could produce a ranking for Australian universities based on the quality indicators in learning and teaching data. They won't do it. And part of the problem is, as I said earlier, there's so many hundreds of different courses that it's almost impossible to compare them. Yeah. If they standardize the courses, we have all the data with which to construct student-centered rankings systems that we could then use to drive positive behavior.
We've got time for a couple more questions. I just want to add to that, though, for Salvatore. Okay, let's devil's advocate. You say that the ranking systems are skewed, but there are a range of different available rankings. So surely some of them are suitable to the needs of some students.
More than half of Australia's universities are in the top 100 on some ranking, which is pretty incredible. But the problem is international data tend only to be available for research. Yeah. We have this rich data in Australia on teaching, but it's not used in the rankings because it's not commensurate with the rich data that are available in the US on teaching.
That's the issue.
And the rich data that are available in the UK on teaching. If Australia created an Australia-focused ranking, and if someone wants to fund that at the CIS, I'd be very happy to lead the effort. We could have a race to the top for teaching in Australia.
I'll echo that, the pledge there for funding for our program. We've got a few more questions. Just one over here and then two over here. Thank you.
Thanks to the CIS for putting this on. I really appreciate it. So my name's Joel Jamal. It seems like a lot of the discussion tonight's been centred around university funding and the looming threat that's going to happen if the dollar crashes or goes up, meaning that a lot of students, the whole funding system for the universities won't be feasible anymore. Recently, Salvatore, you had a conversation with John Anderson this week. It came out, and you talked more about the freedom of speech debate. My question kind of ties into that greater transparency with financing as well. A lot of the universities, they've been severely criticised about there not being enough freedom of speech. And this, I run Turning Point Australia, and this really concerns me because that's something where a lot of students come up to me my age. So we don't feel like it's an open space. I mean, it's a university, it's meant to be a place of open dialogue. That's not what we're getting. You mentioned before that the Minister for Education could possibly throw his weight around a bit more with the public dollar. After all, the public are funding a lot of the university projects. Is this a way we could get around the transparency problem, but also the free speech problem on university campuses and their inability to allow other opinions to be there?
Yeah, so I alienate a lot of people in crowds like this when I say there's no freedom of speech crisis at Australian universities. If I were to say the things I say in public, in the Australian and the Sydney Morning Herald, and I worked for a private company, I would long since have been fired. Right? My job's protected. The problem we have is a viewpoint diversity problem. And that's a very serious problem, that we only have one political viewpoint, and it's not even a Labour viewpoint, it's pretty much a green left viewpoint that is represented in most Australian higher education, or most Australian universities. And that creates problems for students who may not feel comfortable speaking out against their teacher. It creates all sorts of problems that people don't even realize they're biased when they're in an environment where 90% of their colleagues share the same bias. And this is a serious problem. There are ways to fix it that goes well beyond my book. Simon can maybe talk to how to fix it. You're in the business of viewpoint diversity, after all.
Well, we don't experience this issue at least the universities that we're partnering with don't experience this problem in the courses that they're running. Partly because the content of the courses is fundamentally non-ideological and non-partisan. If you're teaching the great books from Homer to T.S. Eliot, and you're not doing it with a spin, then you're not going to get this kind of diversity of view problem. But outside that, I don't know. I don't know what the solution is. Aren't there surveys of Salvatore, of American academics, where very large percentages of people who are not on the left say that they do not feel they can express their opinion?
Well, the reason they feel they can't express their opinions is that there's so few of them.
Right.
And if you're in a department where, out of 20 people, 18 share one political viewpoint, and you're hiring, and there are 80 applicants for this job, what are the chances that you're going to decide what we really need is someone who will challenge us? It's very unlikely, right? So it doesn't take a lot of conspiracies in order to turn an institution that's 60% politicized one direction into one that's 80% into one that's 98% in the same direction. And yes, it's a problem, especially in publicly funded institutions.
So we're just about out of time, so just our final two questions. Just be very brief with your question, please.
Yes, good evening. My name is Lachlan McIntyre. I'm a fifth-year student at the University of Sydney. I'll keep the question relatively narrow, but we've spoken a lot about tonight about exploitation of international students, and I was wondering if you thought that domestic students in a way were exploited as well. There is a trend, I believe, particularly in the group of 8 universities, to inflate the requisite ATAR cut-off, so to say, and there's real perception that if you get into a course at one of these universities, you should do it. And you may find yourself in a group of students who, including international students, are not of the same calibre as yourself, just depending on who you are and where you went. So I was wondering if you thought that perhaps there was a problem with domestic students as well. Thank you.
Well, the problem isn't with students.
The universities.
Look, there are a lot of problems. One that I hear a lot is we have some business programs and, believe it or not, journalism programs that are over 80% Chinese. And as a result, if you have a group doing group work, there's typically only one native English-speaking student in the group. That student inevitably becomes put upon to do the work. There are also problems, just as you said, with ATAR cutoffs, and I give the specific example of psychology in the book. It's very difficult to get into a Bachelor of Psychology program, so universities create a separate course called Bachelor of Psychological Sciences that you can get into with a very low ATAR, or you can get a Bachelor of Education parentheses psychology. And so that your psychology class, which in theory is highly competitive, 95 ATAR to get in fact has this wide mix of students, which is the students at the top, of course, don't get the education they would if they were in an appropriately competitive program, but the students at the bottom are failing out because they're having to compete with students who have wildly different ATAR scores than they have. So yes, there's a lot of problems like that resulting from the marketing-based approach to education instead of a learning-based approach to education.
Using ATAR as a marketing instrument.
Yeah.
So we just have one last one, and then we'll hand over to Tom for some concluding comments. Please.
Evil.
Hi, I'm an international student from Vietnam, and I really do agree with what you said that international students are cash cows. So when I go to the university, UTS, I do realize that like sometimes there are some of the international students having difficult time understanding what the lecturers and what the tutors said, and it kind of affects the discussion and the quality of the class. So do you think that like Australian universities are actually lowering its own standards to increase the number of international students because they bring in a lot of money? Thank you.
Look, I've advocated an absolute cap of 15% international for any university, with 5% international from any one country. And it's not because I'm opposed to internationalization. I'm American. I'm an immigrant here. It's because international students come to Australia first and foremost to learn English, to make lifelong connections in a developed country setting, to hopefully get employment experience. And all of that depends on being surrounded by native English-speaking Australian students. If I went to a program in France, no matter how excellent the program, if that program were 80% English speaking, I would never learn French. Right now, if I'm part of the 5% of the program who speaks English and everyone around me speaking French, I'll learn French. Well, I probably won't, but a good learner would learn French, and that's the problem, is that it's for the international students' own benefit that we should have modest, still very large numbers of international students. I mean, Australia is 1/3 international. I use that example of 100 domestic, 50 international because that's the typical ratio. The highest rate of international student enrollment at any U.S. public university is under 20% in the entire country. That comparison, I think, should, the average Australian university is more international than the most international university in the entire United States. Yeah. That should tell you something about how international students have been misused in Australia.
Glenn, thank you. And thank you for that last question. That was a terrific question to conclude the evening. And ladies and gentlemen, please thank Glenn Fahey, Salvatore Babones and Simon Haines. Terrific stuff. Great work. I have to say, listening to the panel this evening brought to mind something that Kylie Moore Gilbert has said recently, and this is in her memoirs. Now, Kylie Moore Gilbert is that brave Australian academic at the University of Melbourne who spent 804 days in an Iranian jail. And this week she's just launched her memoirs. In fact, she's doing an event this evening at Lee Books in the city. And this is what she says about universities. Quote, "I'm cynical about academia. I love teaching and I love research, but teaching isn't valued at universities anymore. And nobody really cares about research. It's all about chasing the grants, the money. Higher education is in just a terrible state. And she's just got out of an Iranian jail." That's Kylie Moore. That's Kylie Moore Gilbert, and she and I have been talking over the last year about doing an event at CIS, and I'm pretty confident she will do an event here. If not in April, then certainly May, so we'll keep you informed about that. She's a brave, very sound academic, but that quote, I think, says a lot, doesn't it? Yeah. I want to thank the panel, and I want to thank all of you for being here. If it weren't for supporters, foundations and individuals, we at CIS would not exist. We don't accept tax dollars. We're a private institution, and that's especially the case for our education program, thanks to foundations and individuals. So please keep supporting us. If you're not a member, please think about becoming one, and please keep coming to our events. For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.